Good evening. So today I wanted to try to take up the subject of sarvanut, of refusal, or perhaps a less friendly word would be desertion from one's military post, in particular in the context of current ongoing discussions here in the state of Israel that result again from a lot of the recent political tug-of-war surrounding proposed reforms to the judicial system, because we have now letters and petitions being signed by reservists from different positions in the military who are saying that they're going to refuse to show up for duty, or that they're going to stop volunteering their time for reserve duty if the judicial reforms pass, with the reason being given that if the judicial reforms pass, then the state will no longer be a democracy, it'll be some kind of dictatorship or ruined democracy, and it will no longer deserve their service and commitment in the way that it currently does. Some notion of that kind, without putting too many words in other people's mouths. But the point is, it's a very current question, whether or not it's appropriate to behave in this way. And I actually did want to pick this up through a source in the Torah itself, because I think, interestingly, we have quite a lengthy passage in Sefer Dvarim in the Torah dedicated to the question of the case of someone who feels unwilling to go out to war with the army at the time that the nation of Israel was going to war against its enemies, and the different kinds of cases where maybe that might be an acceptable behavior to refuse to participate. Before diving into that, I think it's worth just commenting briefly on the current events, because at one level, there's a lot that I think one can say analytically about what's going on that operates pretty close to the surface, and we don't even necessarily need to jump into the text in the Torah, although I think it will ultimately be more interesting to do the latter. But just talking about the current events, I think that one thing that has to be admitted is that part of what we're seeing here is the kind of third or fourth generation effect of the communist light, socialist, kibbutznik, organized labor culture on which the modern state of Israel was founded, in the sense that in a Marxist setting of that kind, group action of any group, in a sense, that is actually trying to use the leverage of their group action to act in their own self-interest, even their own economic self-interest, is viewed positively, right? There's some sense in which, if you're going to run a good kind of Marxist society or communist society or whatever, then striking has to be viewed as a good thing, because it's like the workers showing that they can band together and engage in direct action and bring about revolutionary change and leverage their ability to produce things and all of that jazz. This doesn't need to be a whole seminar on Marxism. And one must admit, there have been times when workers, especially in the early 20th century, late 19th century, during the Industrial Revolution, where working conditions in factories were horrible, and maybe workers decided that they wanted to stop dying in machine accidents all the time or whatever. You can imagine situations where there really is a sense in which a strike may have been a real cry for justice in the face of tremendous injustice. And, without talking about particular instances, because I think even those stories are really very complicated given the kind of abject misery that industrialization was lifting people out of at the time. But all that being said, let's acknowledge sometimes a strike or something like it can be motivated in part by a legitimate call to justice. The problem is that once you create a culture of a society that is where everything that everyone is taught is fired by these inadequate and twisted Marxist ideas, then you have to start saying that it's just good to be striking all the time about everything, and that every time someone strikes, there's something heroic about it. But of course, at some level, striking can just be a negotiating tool for a group of people to act in their own interest, and even out of naked greed at some level, to see if they can get more for themselves by using the greater power they have by banding together as a collective. I mean, at the end of the day, people love to talk about how corporations are nefarious entities that squash the little guy. And that obviously in its own way is a huge oversimplification, and corporations do many wonderful and positive things, and also sometimes are responsible for negative things. But to the degree that the critique of a corporation is fair, that it aggregates a bunch of economic interests into a big giant, and then that giant is bigger than any individual, the same is true of a union, the same is true of a mob that's striking or acting in the interest, the shared interest of the members of the mob. And so one thing you have to acknowledge is that when you raise a bunch of people in a society for generations, just kind of applauding strikes and applauding socialistic direct action, it shouldn't be so surprising that it can become the case that you could end up with an elite ruling class that develops a capacity to applaud itself and pat itself on the back for, again, acting in its naked self-interest. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, the kinds of people who are threatening not to show up for duty, as being reported in various news outlets, are not mostly the rank and file, these sort of infantry combat soldiers. There are different kinds of elite units, especially, right? Fighter pilots. A recent letter was written about in the newspapers about Sayeret Matkal, this elite commando unit, cyber and associated intelligence units. So we're talking about people who, at this point, they're in these echelons of Tzahal, of the army, where it's assumed that when they get out, that they're supposed to have a fantastic job in high tech or in some kind of cybersecurity or whatever else slice of the industry waiting for them, because they have tremendous skills, they have all these connections, they've used it all in the field. And to some degree, that's fine. There's no problem with giving people, economic opportunities for the talents that they've developed. And also, partly to some degree as a reward from society for the risks they've taken, for the sacrifices they've made, all of that. But the point is that this group of people that we're talking about, they're not on a path to being on the bottom rung of the society that they're a part of. They're on a path to being the new, unicorn founders. They're going to be the ones selling their company for $1 billion to Google or what have you. And they are the ones in greater percentages and in greater numbers now threatening to refuse to show up for duty, because their politics tell them that tampering with the powers of the Supreme Court is wrong. But the question that has to be asked is, why does it seem to them that tampering with the powers of the Supreme Court is wrong? Is it in fact a heroic crusade to protect democracy and freedom and all of these noble ideals? Perhaps in the eyes of these various people, it is in part that, because people are always the most effective when they have an idealism that coheres with the actions that they also can take that serve their more narrow interests, because then you can feel inspired to do what helps yourself, and what could be more powerful motivation. So yes, I'm sure people tell the story, and they also to some degree believe the story that they are the defenders of democracy. But also at some level, we're talking about an echelon of society that is, in terms of statistical percentages, biased towards being various things, biased towards having a wealthier socioeconomic background, biased towards being Ashkenazi as opposed to Mizrahi, biased towards being secular as opposed to religious. If we're talking about all these different slices of Israeli society, and all of these things are not 100%, right? But that's what we're talking about if we're defining the archetypal member of one of these units, and that's decreasingly the case perhaps over the time, but historically it's been very much the case. And it's that same sector of the population that gets undemocratic, oligarchical favoritism from the Supreme Court. Like the Supreme Court, if we look objectively at its various decisions over time, it is not a dispassionate arbiter that protects freedom per se. It protects what it calls freedoms when that aligns with protecting the political agenda of the secular left. And that tends to be, again, the politics of very much the same people that we've just been talking about. And also that's not just about, again, matching to people's idealism, it becomes also an issue of matching to their economic interests. One of the issues that's been raised about the Supreme Court, this rhetoric that people are throwing around is, if we tamper with the Supreme Court at all, there will immediately be warrants from the International Court of Justice or whatever else in The Hague, and suddenly there'll be bounties on the heads of all these different former members of the Israeli military who had seen before them a lifetime of success in the global economy, selling their startup for $1 billion and jet setting around the world. And now suddenly there's a bit of nervousness about that because, who's going to take a look at their passport and say, sorry, but we have some kind of treaty. We're going to hand you over to Interpol and ship you off to The Hague to, stand in some kangaroo court where Europeans will happily start lynching Jews by accusing them of war crimes that only exist in the European imagination because of the much greater experience Europeans have of committing real war crimes. So if we're talking in those terms, then this is a group of people where it's simply, according to a certain line of argument that's not entirely implausible, it must be acknowledged, there's a risk that they may be exposed to as a result of judicial reform that might, among other things, hurt their economic interest. It also fits to say, this is an end to democracy, which it isn't by any sensible definition of democracy, but who's counting when all we need is rhetoric to pat ourselves on the back? And so you have a group of people who are casting themselves in the role of not a mob, but a collective of idealistic warriors for freedom who are, so to speak, casting away their medals, all of that kind of theater to show how much they oppose these changes out of a sense of idealism. But the reality is, from a different perspective, what we're seeing is a ruling class that understands that the political institution that's being scrutinized and possibly edited right now, they understand that this political institution is the one that most avowedly favors them and their interests and has done so historically. And so they're organizing through collective action to protect their interests in the way that many different kinds of striking groups do. But the point is that just because a group of people is striking, that doesn't make them virtuous, because they just as easily can be construed as a different kind of corporation, meaning a different kind of way of aggregating the interests of people into a giant that has leverage because it can wield a fist. But when the giant wields its fist is a moral question, and you can't just say, just because you're a giant that is not incorporated as some kind of limited liability company seeking profit, that you must therefore be virtuous. You can be a giant that is a mob of self-interest seeking individuals who figured out a way of aligning their interests so that they have leverage, and they can be just as greedy as people sometimes like to cast corporations as being, and just as lacking in virtue, depending on how that leverage is being deployed and for what reason. So that's a prefatory remark in some sense that pertains more to present events, and you'll notice we haven't gotten much yet into the sources from Torah and Talmud that may be relevant to this. So now I think we can jump into Sefer Dvarim and ask the question from the standpoint of the Torah itself more seriously. Okay, fine. Maybe in this particular case, it's easier to kind of take some air out of the balloon by pointing out the foibles of the particular individuals involved, because it's much more obviously hypocritical. But if we back away from that, we could also ask, from a theoretical standpoint, what would the Torah consider to be a legitimate reason to behave in this way, right? Because the way that I've just cast things, it seems obvious that it's not a legitimate way to behave. But we have to ask where the line is drawn. Is the Torah totally opposed to some kind of refusal of military service? Is the idea that that always is actually a self-interested thing, and because you're acting in your own interest instead of the interest of the nation, that you're always wrong? That goes too far. That's not actually where the Torah draws the line. And so the case it talks about, it's one of these passages that begins, Ki tetzeh lamilchama. I won't read the preface because it's lengthy, and just to focus on the part. So now we get to the point where the officers are asking people questions. It says, V'dibru hashotrim el ha'am le'emor, mi ha'ish asher bana bait hadash v'lo hanacho yelech v'yashov leveto pen yamut b'milchama v'ish aher yahanachenu. And the officers shall speak to the people, saying, what man is there who has built a new house and has not dedicated it? Let him go and return to his house, lest he die in battle, and another man dedicates it. The passage goes on. And what about a man who has planted a vineyard and has not yet eaten of it? Let him also go and return to his house, lest he die in battle, and another man eats of it. And what if there is a man who has betrothed a wife and has not taken her? Let him go and return to his house, lest he die in battle, and another man takes her. And then it closes with this idea of, what if a man is fearful and faint-hearted? Then he should go and return to his house, lest his brother's heart be faint as well. So we actually have a number of different kinds of cases here that are laid out. One of them is maybe the simplest, which is the last one. It's just saying, look, fundamentally, if you are filled with fear and you don't think you can function in the context of going to war, then you're not an asset. And people for whom that truly is the case, HaKadosh Baruch Hu does not want us to haze them, does not want us to torture them, does not want us to ostracize them, does not want us to send them to their death, nor does he want them to pollute the morale of the platoon that this person is being included in. And so it's very sensible and it's very merciful. The other examples, I think, are the ones that I want to focus on more. These three examples. First of all, someone who's built a house but hasn't lived in it yet. Second, someone who has planted a vineyard and not yet eaten of it. And third, someone who is engaged to be married, but hasn't yet consummated the marriage or completed the marriage and taken his wife to their home, started a family, that kind of thing. So why are those three cases interesting? Well, first of all, I think we can analyze them on their own, and then I think there's a connection to an interesting Gemara that we've actually talked about in the series of Shiurim before for a different reason. What I think these different cases have in common is a variety of factors. One is that they all pertain to having not yet fulfilled a possibility that has somehow already presented itself and already taken the investment of effort, right? That it takes time and effort to build a house. It takes time and effort to plant and cultivate a vineyard. It also takes time and effort to marry well. And for anyone who has achieved those things, and there's the potential for them to realize that gain, there's something that cries out to us about the idea that such a person should never taste the fruit of his effort, or should never enjoy the house that he built, or should never get to start building a family, or get to enjoy his time with the wife that he is married or is about to marry, before perhaps losing his life. So in one sense, this is an acknowledgement that we're talking about a situation where not everyone is expected to come back. War is always somewhat deadly. And to the degree that that's the case, it would be too much of some kind of busha, too much, an outrage or a shame to allow someone not to, in any degree, taste the fruits or feel the fulfillment of such precious things that have been built or cultivated. And I think this last example we mentioned before about someone being fearful, it clearly in that sense falls in a separate category, and it also, for our discussion, falls in a separate category because we're talking about, at the beginning of this discussion, Sayerat Matkal, Shmone Matayim, and fighter pilots, right? So, in other words, some of either the most brave or the most seasoned and effective and committed elite contributors to this nation's defense. And it's fair to point out that in the case of people doing cybersecurity, that maybe they're not facing dangers that one always did in war, if we're talking about 3,000 years ago. And so perhaps some of them, if confronted with the possibility of actually marching out to battle, might fall into the category of people who are faint of heart. But if we focus on fighter pilots and Sayerat Matkal, they clearly are not such people, right? That we've already been selected not to be that. And so if by these criteria, if we were to imagine that they're one of these people, we'd have to be asking, is anything about what these people are doing right now equivalent in some sense to, I've built a house, or I've, engaged to be married, or I've planted a vineyard, and I haven't tasted the fulfillment of it? I think there are two kinds of answers you would give to that question, trying to be fair to people. One of them is, obviously, none of these cases apply. No one is saying, I have served bravely and continually for many years in this role, being a fighter pilot, being an elite commando, but now that I just got married or what have you, and that's why I'm doing this. They're not saying that it's because of a vineyard or a house or a marriage. They're saying it's because of proposed reforms to the judicial system. So in one sense, you could say, okay, one way of reading this passage in the Torah is really to be giving a fairly short enumerated list, and saying, look, here are some things that HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, okay, fine. Some reasons not to go to war are good enough, but if you don't meet these criteria, which is most other cases, then you need to go, because if people can refuse to go to war because they wanted our Olympic uniforms to be blue and instead they turned out to be white, then the whole thing unravels, right? It's not normally the case that you give every soldier the right. I made a facetious example. They're talking about the Olympics, but political tests are not things that you can involve with participation in the military without the whole thing falling apart, because people disagree about all sorts of things, right? They disagree about the legalization of marijuana. They disagree about the voting age. They disagree about the payroll tax, or what, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So are we now, is it open season? Anyone who, wanted the governing coalition to include this party instead of that one, but otherwise it's okay, and so, I'm not going to show up for duty anymore, you clearly can't allow that. And the people who are making this stand, they would of course say, no, but that's not what this is. I'm like Mahatma Gandhi, I'm like Martin Luther King, because this is a moment where this is a cry, a unique cry for justice, a moment in history where one has to make this kind of stand, even though I never would have over the payroll tax or over this or over that. But of course, the problem with that is that if you make that gamble in a situation where the reality is much more checkered, which is the case here for reasons we've already discussed, the fact that this is people acting very much in their self-interest, the fact that this is a ruling class acting to preserve an institution that grants them undemocratic power, the fact that the actual proposed changes to the judicial system are not marching troops into the parliament to commit a massacre, but rather a quantitative modification of a set of procedures in a stable democracy that has been continuing to function despite much more revolutionary shifts in the other direction that have happened multiple times, where the court has grabbed more power for itself, and somehow there wasn't blood in the streets then. So the argument that now this is the moment simply doesn't withstand scrutiny with a bit of dispassion, looking at the facts, and it opens the door now to all sorts of other kinds of refusal, and could seriously damage the military's long-term ability to operate coherently and with predictability. So from one perspective, you could say that the Torah is teaching us that. It's saying, look, there are actually innumerably few reasons not to participate in war when the nation goes to war, and that's because there really are, a lot of reasons that may be tempting, but you just have to say, look, this doesn't work unless people have supreme commitment, because this is a collective action by the nation. And that does notice that none of these criteria, I should say, have anything to do with, and if the king is someone you like, or if the king is someone you don't like, right? Or if the king is someone you think has good judgment, or if the king is someone you think has bad judgment. And because that way lies destruction and dissolution and unraveling and folly, right? The moment that everyone is asked to sort of present, to make a litmus test of, oh, well, did my party win the election or not? And on that basis, I'll decide whether or not I fight for my country. We're in a very bad way. And that, unfortunately, is what's infected, not the military as a whole, but the mindset, again, of these very elite and specialized slices of the military that are particularly interested in protecting their own opportunities and protecting political power that is already in their hands through the operation of current existing institutions. Now, to be fair, there's another way of reading this passage. You could also say that we could look at this in terms of categories that have an abstract definition and that really cover a broader set of cases. And this, to be fair, is a kind of principle we see often in halacha, like in nizikin, where you have damages caused by, an ox that runs around and tramples people or their crops, or a hole that someone falls into, or a fire that spreads. Chazal don't just say in Parshat Mishpatim, no, this is just about fires, or this is just about oxen. It becomes in the Talmud a general set of categories for talking about different kinds of torts and damages. And so maybe you could argue that that's what's going on here. And so we could say, okay, what is a house that I've built? That's something I made, I invested effort in. It's a piece of property that I own, but it's also a device that I can use in a sense. And so it's something I created through my labor. And now I want to make use of it. Or, we could go over to the kerem, the vineyard, and say, well, this has more to do with, it has a relationship to the house, but what's different is you already have the house. You could start using it tomorrow. The kerem you've planted, but maybe, you have to wait months before actually there'll be grapes, or even years before there are grapes that you're allowed to eat according to the Torah because of Orlah, right? So having not yet tasted the fruit of your vineyard could take time. The realization of your investment may take more time, unlike the house. So that's making a distinction, but it's saying, okay, this is another thing where you've invested effort and you haven't got to realize the benefit of that effort. And then, of course, with a spouse, maybe it's a more general statement about family, right? Like that there are family considerations that take time to develop, and your family can need you, and your family can depend on you and require your presence in order for it to flourish in ways that require you to sit this one out. And so maybe these are more general categories, and you could start asking, and I mean, this is me trying to be maximally fair, and maybe this would be an interesting discussion in practical halacha in that sense, if we could assemble all the relevant sources, that if we said, okay, maybe you could argue someone who is just about to finish their service in Shmona Matayim, or has been a reservist for Shmona Matayim or whatever, that they do expect that they sacrificed for a while. They were giving very high cost labor at a pittance because tzahal doesn't pay well. And they invested that time and effort. And yes, it was partly about serving their country, but also then it was about afterwards getting to found a company and getting to build that company and getting to sell it for $1 billion. And they've put in that effort. And now someone's going to come along and throw, a pall of uncertainty over all of that, because maybe tomorrow there won't be any more Israeli unicorns because no one will be buying Israeli companies, because foreign capital will dry up when everyone starts to believe the false hue and cry about Israel becoming a dictatorship. So to be fair, part of the reason that everyone's worried about Israel becoming a dictatorship is because Israelis are shouting to the world and to the rooftops that that's what's happening, despite the fact that that's not at all true. And so you could say maybe such people are partly responsible for the risk that they now see looming ahead of them. But if we sweep that issue aside, you could perhaps argue that certain government policies could negatively impact their economic prospects, and therefore, they, in order to protect those interests somehow, and realize the benefit of the effort they've invested, maybe somehow it could be the case that it's not totally wrong of someone to try to leverage or let's say to refuse to participate in war because of those considerations. So that's me trying to make the best case that I can for that argument within the context of this source that I think is a very relevant one. But I'm going to immediately disagree with that argument because I don't think in any of these cases that are being authorized here that there's any sense at all that the individual who is refusing to serve is doing so somehow in order to apply a lever to the nation and make the nation do what he wants, right? He has a house, or he has a fiance, or he has a vineyard that may yet produce fruit that he could taste, right? So the focus is on the realization of those potential gains in this life, and the fear of losing life, because it all rounds up again. It closes on the idea of there's this person who's afraid that he's going to die and he's just faint of heart. And really, in some sense, that might be a comment on these three, that it's really about what happens if I die here. Then I'm never going to be able to do those things. If I knew I wasn't going to die, then this wouldn't work, right? Then you would go and fight. It doesn't say if you're worried that the war is going to cause the price of your investments to drop, then you can refuse to serve because you want to undercut the military of your own country and prevent it from being able to fight successfully. That's not what this is saying. This is not about applying a lever to the nation to coerce it into not acting against what you view to be your own interests. It's just saying, I'm afraid I'm going to die before I get to see these benefits. And that is the proper attitude for which HaKadosh Baruch Hu will say, okay, fine. Yeah, in that case, I'm not going to make you risk your life while you have the idea that maybe you're going to die never tasting the fruit of the vineyard or what have you. So it may be a more general category of thing. Particularly if you say, well, what if he planted an orchard instead of a vineyard? Is it about grapes, Dafka? And we'll see in a sense it is about grapes in a moment. But seemingly, it should be just as much the case that if someone labored to plant a peach orchard and he wants to taste the peaches, that this same kind of argument would apply. And it's not just about grapes, but it is about fear of death. And it's definitely not about a collective action to wield the ability to refuse to protect your country to somehow further your own economic or other interests. And that, I think, is where we land with this idea of this sakvanut, like the refusals that are going on right now, with a denunciation of them. Because at the end of the day, it is kind of jaw-dropping that you would have people who a moment ago supposedly were saying that they were willing to defend their country and risk their life in order to do it. But now they suddenly are making that commitment conditional out of some reference to shallow principles that they don't understand and they haven't considered, because to say that we're on the brink of dictatorship and that this is the death of democracy is lunacy according to the definition of those terms. It's empty rhetoric that allows people to feel good about acting in their interest in a more narrow way, and to refuse to defend your country as a way of applying leverage to it. I don't know. It's honestly, I mean, one should remember that it's not necessarily all or the majority of people in such units who are trying to apply this pressure, but the ones who are willing to, what they're saying is that I actually didn't sign up to defend the Jewish people no matter what. I signed up to defend the Jewish people conditional on their having exactly this or that kind of procedure in their constitutional system. And if we fiddle with that a bit, they'll still be Jews, but I'm not willing to defend them anymore, even if someone else is coming to try to annihilate them. Because those are the stakes, right? We're talking about cyber warfare in preparation for a nuclear strike from Iran. We're talking about blowing up the Iranian nuclear reactor. We're talking about gathering intelligence behind enemy lines. Everyone involved in this understands how high those stakes are. And they're saying, well, look, you know, I was willing to defend a certain kind of Israeli state, but if the Jewish state stops being, flavored in the right kind of labor Zionist, secular Western, liberal, socialist leaning way, and only in a quantitative sense, because we're not talking about nightfall and the full collapse of anything. We're talking about a incremental change in procedures. If it moves even one click in that direction, yes, it's still, where the majority of Jews in the world live, but I'm not going to defend them anymore, even though the threats to them are only greater. That I can't help but say is deplorable. And I would encourage anyone thinking that way to reconsider, because if originally there was any idea of defending the Jewish people as part of why one was making this superlative sacrifice or giving the superlative commitment to the state of Israel, what makes those people Jewish is that their ancestors carried the Torah with them and tried to keep it for thousands of years. And even if that's the case, even if starting 100 years ago, their more recent ancestors decided that they were done with that, and to suddenly withhold the protection that one was trying to provide for the Jewish people because of some perceived problem with leaning too much in the direction of the Torah or not leaning enough in the direction of standards that come from other countries outside the Torah. There's no way of talking about that kind of an action from the standpoint of Torah with admiration. It has to be deplored, and it's really disgraceful.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. If you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.